to Regis for your remarks. And now, to finish this panel, I will give the floor to Dr. Alejandro Pisanty Baru. Very briefly, Alejandro Pisanty. I'm a doctor in chemistry that has worked in computing since 1992. Velma considers me her friend, and I am sure I am. I thank Velma Arellano specifically, as well as Sergio Carrera, General Director of Infotech, as well as to Patricia Ara, because the is that I am sure gave their approval for me to be invited here. I'm also bearing an unexpected responsibility, which is being the only person that is not an attorney at this panel. However, I was given the final opportunity to show my ignorance on this field. Let me just begin with some brief remarks, and then I will continue with the last topics. Alan Gottmik states that there are three attitudes towards any type of innovation in internet or information technologies. He describes it as the never better, the never worse, and the always or ever was. This means going from the hyper-optimism that there has never been something as good as what we currently have, the ultra-pessimists such as Morasso, Nicholas Carr, and others that say that, well, this is almost the end of the world, of at least the end of Western civilization, and those that recognize or that say, well, this is the same as it has always been, those that somehow deny the innovation. I refuse to be technologically pessimist. I am too pessimist to be a total optimist, and I do not think the position of nothing is new to be very useful. However, we need to take the positive aspects of all these stances. E-commerce ended up being commerce. Lots of it considered that it was the continuation of commerce through other means. In the same regard, the cloud is not anything but massive data centers with the delocalization that they entail. A large amount of data treatment in between companies, in intranets and so on, is nothing. Is none other that we consider the electronic exchange of data between companies, and even e-commerce might also be regarded just as eddy on steroids, or only what happened to anything when it is mounted on an IP protocol platform. This innovation in which we do not need to receive anybody's approval. And in this regard, big data, the same that happened with supercomputing is happening with big data. The definition of supercomputing is specialized computing. It is the most advanced available calculation capacities in the world. And big data are the most important data analysis capacities that existed today. We could have started discussing big data since the holaric boards were introduced in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. At that time, we started to have somebody that could collect data as well as treat it anonymously. With regards to the citizens, the data were probably very basic and elemental. The treatment that could be made and the intervention in the lives of people was very limited. However, back then there was still the construction of this big brother that was identified recently in the 40s by Orwell with his novel 1984. But besides this big brother, we had the little brothers, as Mr. Leander said. We had the small data. We do not need big data to know how much the principal of the school spends in food and drink. These unruly little brothers are at times a bigger risk than the big brother. So speaking of big data, makes it necessary to discuss open data and open government, as Dr. Puyol already did. because usually the state is the main stakeholder in society that has historically possessed or have accessed or controlled the larger volumes of data until very recently when Alonso said now electronic transactions are living records that at times are excessive, that at times are justified. When, for example, we talk about the transition from barcodes to RFID, we go from the standpoint of knowing when chickens are shipped or unloaded for supermarkets to know that and in real time what is the temperature of that chicken and when will the total shipment went below or above the required temperature levels, for example. This traceability in foods is and medication is are applications in which we forget big data is being produced, and not only big data, huge data. And we need to consider that a large amount of what we're doing with large volumes, with enormous volumes of data, is not something that has been requested from us. It does not correspond to the specifications of a system requested by a client. On the side of IT, we started doing it following the motto or following the answer to the great existential question of Edmund Hillary, the first Westerner to have climbed the Everest. To the question of why did he climb the Everest, he said, because it's there. Because it's there. And that is an answer we obtain from the side of IT to many things that we're currently doing. What did you think about doing it? Well, because we can. And it is, in some cases, it is a very good attitude to know what can be done. And that is precisely the road of the most widespread road for innovation. There are hundreds of because it's theirs that are very will be buried. This is a key comment. Some engineers will be happy not to hear anymore about law, but think about the amount of skeletons in the closets of a source forge, for example, the amount of software or large software projects that were just there because no client, no healthy community drove them forwards. But that because it's there is a very important reason why we are now delving on big data. We do not analyze risks sufficiently on a broad framework. We discuss privacy and legality, but probably we would win a lot from if we were to discuss only about the risk management on big data, and then we would be discussing all disciplines. We would be focusing this to all disciplines. To all disciplines, we could approach with the standpoint of risk management. Analyzing impact and probability, selecting risks in which the product or the summation of those that are on the quadrant of the higher impact or probability, which are the first one that needs treatment are, and all the disciplines to transfer of right risk identification of occurrence, mitigation, response, contingency plans, continuity plans. Saying this from the standpoint of all social actors, the companies, the banks, for example, have an interest in preventing money laundering. First, due to compliance with legal requirements or being rid of scandals, as many banks had, or also for their own financial security, because having amounts coming from money laundering have certain implications for their stability beyond compliance. So. In this society, in this discussion in which all data generators, data analysts, and individuals that enter into the system could engage in a very intelligent conversation to find out how to mitigate the risks that arise from big data when we're dealing with public and private data of individuals. One of the risks, one of the 8-layer risks, not admitted risk. It is the risk that takes place or that arises when this treatment goes to the entire society. And an 8-layer risk is not only in terms of privacy, because it is well regulated, but as probably Alberto cannot confess in public, there is the risk of discrimination, that begins with positive discrimination that is regarded kindly. You will not get offers from the bank that do not correspond to your level of risk of transactions, of income. You will not get cruise offers if your accounts receive 4,000 pesos a month. You will not get offers from a discount shop if your income and your bank transactions amount to 150,000 pesos a month. But in the process, we might lose a series of opportunities for the citizens, not only commercial opportunities that represent a high risk of discrimination. I do not want to take the attitude of saying that the sky is falling down, but this is the sort of things we need to consider when we are looking at this with a broad scope, when we consider the evolution of the systems on a 10-year panorama, and also when the systems are government-owned, when we discuss one of the aspects of open government that I would like to emphasize. Just to put in context some of what previous speakers said, there's the treatment of public data by small private organizations, of startups, of commercial ventures, of citizens organizations focused on specific topics that could go from transportation to others that have a higher political and social impact, such as, for example, detecting discrimination factors, abuse factors, or any indications of abuse in public expenditure directed towards the population before electoral seasons, favor with agricultural credits certain populations that are, for example, based on an apple analysis or plot by plot of land, an analysis of who they might be induced to vote to by using public funds. This sort of overseeing also has many political aspects, also many aspects in terms of discrimination. Another issue that we need to start discussing intelligently and intensively between technicians and attorneys with a political view is this issue that has been constantly alluded to, which is de-anonymization, which can take place in several ways. A small surprise is that if you look for, let me give you a very concrete example that I used in the study, the information of recipients of certain types of subsidies. In a very specific case, we have the subsidy to agricultural diesel. It is a very important subsidy that reduces the cost of energy for people that work the fields, for agriculturists. However, in this list, it is very easy to identify names of individuals that were called nylon peasants. This is to say, those that used synthetic fiber clothing instead of their traditional natural fiber clothing. This is people that work in companies, in banks, but that might have pieces of land here and there. And even though their activities are mostly recreational rather than productive, they can have access to this subsidy to fuel. And we can identify these individuals, and then we might ask, that information shouldn't be publicly available. However, the recipients of these subsidies, the names and the personal data of the recipients of these subsidies are regarded of public interest. So it is a monster that citizens have created themselves based on our transparency requirements without thinking about the greater law that is often neglected in the development of these larger-scale systems. That is not the law of protection of personal data or access of information or the civil code or the criminal code or the constitution of the republic or any of its derivative laws. It is the law of unexpected consequences. With that, I mean, at times there are no guilty parties in the law of unexpected consequences. It is the construction by patching up a system. Because when this system is regarded as a whole, there can be this series of behavior that is striking, to put it mildly. There is also the issue of de-anonymization, not only in terms of how Leandro discussed, in which we could say, well, I will reduce from a 1 million population of which I have data, then I would eliminate who they are, and by reducing this amount of data, we end up having a subpopulation of 500,000 individuals, for example, that have a certain features in terms of age and so on, that might be regarded as good people, as the individuals that need to be given a message that they have to go to a hospital to get a screening for a disease that they might be carrying, or, for example, the misuse of these large information assets by interested parties, for example, to identify the the population that is more prone to kidnapping or extortion. And also, considering the enormous amount of data that we produce, it is necessary to consider, for example, mobility through cell phones. Put in the wrong hands, that could very quickly made it possible for somebody to say, well, this person leaves work every Tuesday afternoon, but stays a couple of hours at a certain place before going home. These are the sort of patterns that could make somebody more prone to extortion, for example. There's software available for that, and there's also a black market of this sort of software. And this leads us to the problem of de-anonymization, and also the introduction of all the safeguards that us as citizens are looking for. And that produces risk that is not usually considered during risk assessment, which has to do with friction. Most models, most e-business models assume a very low friction. They assume that everything we want to do can be done. That if I want a piece of data, and if I can have access to it, and if I can have access to that data, I can treat it. That the models of electronic commerce or data treatment in general, the more friction they get. For example, more legal authorization requirements, then that produces entry barriers for innovation. To the extent that we need a legal apparatus, a team of lawyers that would be backing up this data analysis activities. And with that, we're making that all startups and technical and academic research teams of universities or institutions such as Infotech will not be able to enter this field, being at a disadvantage compared to large organizations or governments that have better capabilities in terms of analysis, or also having reserves for litigation on certain operations. And I will go to internet governance, which was the topic that I was asked to develop by Vilma. Also, I have the chance to make this relevant in a few minutes. As you know, the internet is a network of networks. It is an interconnection of networks. Some say that the internet is not even a network. It is just an agreement. Networks are created by people, by companies, by government agencies, and what makes them part of the internet is the agreement of connecting them, of connecting each other, and taking the traffic of those that are connected with me to others that are not part of my own network. In that matter, the internet is growing in a very decentralized manner. The only agreement that needs to be considered in the internet is obeying or actually implementing the technical protocols, the IP protocol or the stack of the IP protocol. TCP, it is possible to send traffic without TCP. It can be UDP, such as with the internet or IP calls, not even with traffic control. And any of the protocols that are accepted by the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, need to be complied with. And with that, I am already on the Internet. I do not have to implement the web, because the web is at a higher level. Actually, the DNS, the domain name service, is not part of the Internet infrastructure. It is actually an application. However, there are a couple of aspects in which we should agree, besides the use of protocols. And this has to do with the unicity of public IP address as allocation. You can use whatever IP addresses you want within a network, but you need to use public IP addresses that are unique towards the outside of the network. And the unicity between the allocation of domain names and IP networks, because every domain names must absolutely predictably correspond to IP address. While these were very few, and it was just MIT 1218, for example, the computer had no interest. But as this acquired semantics, when somebody realized that the series of characters on the DNS could be Vancomer, for example, then that acquired a commercial value, then that acquired an industrial property interest, and thus this system prompted the creation of a specific governance system to register protocol parameters, domain names, IP addresses, and so on. So on some chart, it says that port 80 of TCP protocol is allocated to the HTTP protocol, and that is the record of the technical parameters. And so within, well, a very specific organization was created, organization for assigning names and numbers that does not exceed or is not all internet governance. Governance is used. It is a term that has been poorly copied into Spanish, but governance has to do with all formal and informal agreements, legal or non-legal, that go all the way to the labels, to the RFC 9051 from Netiquette, that suggests not to answer all the jokes we receive as spam on our email. Spam, for example, is regulated, is mal-regulated, but it is mal-regulated in certain organizations, as well as phishing and anti-phishing. When governments aggressively started to or tried to intervene in the internet, with the summits of information in 2005, showed that this governance happens with the participation of all actors, government, academic, commercial actors, and civil society stakeholders. This is what we know. The people that hold the stake. This means that they have some interest in the proper functioning of the internet, and these are known as multiple actor parties models, or it is always or a multi-stakeholder model. Some of the hot topics in terms of internet governance are closely connected to the hot topics of big data or open data and open government. Topics such as privacy and protection of personal data, which have become extremely complex because, as Leandro, Mr. Puyol were saying, the protection of data is very well regulated, but it is just a subset of what we understand as privacy, a subset that was isolated in the 60s and 70s, arising from the concerns of privacy of individuals, because personal information could be accessed when this existed on computing systems. And there had to be regulation about this. However, the disclosure of the personal data, such as in Facebook or as in other types of less personal and more technical means, have made integrity to become data. The separation made when personal data protection was created, when that legislation was created, was to say, well, all other concerns that exist in terms of privacy allude to the intimate lives of individuals, and these are very complicated to address. So why the public interest subjects have to have lower rights in terms of what can be considered private. We do not care how many lovers a person that is not a public interest individual has, but just the fact that the Prime Minister friends has lovers, for example, it could be a matter of interest to increase the appreciation of the population for an individual or to weaken their political stance. That is a very cultural matter, but it is very difficult to regulate because it is a matter of degrees and moments.
But we've reached a point where we need to rethink this. Other great concerns associated to this with regards to internet governance, but that we also need to pay attention to in the world of big data, are those that have to do with Snowden's revelations. To see the amount of data collected by governments and how they're not always transparent. Although this may sound radical, the best place for your information to be treated secretly has been in the States, because there's laws, there's courts, even if they are in the shadows. So let's ask about the CISEN in Mexico, or the Russian or the Chinese intelligence. So this led to I don't know if you remember Wag of the Dog, a movie where Justin Hoffman acts, where in the case there's a sexual scandal of the president, so they invent a dog, and governments such as Brazil and Germany invent that they are angry of the fact that their phone calls were intercepted to their presidents, and the real phone wasn't encrypted. The normal cell phone was the one that was spied on. But they need to create a scandal to not confess that that this was because I don't think there's no prime minister of Germany or Brazil that doesn't assume that all the governments of the world are interested in listening to their conversations and that their staff is trying to prevent this. The embarrassment is that this may happen. The cause, whatever it is, this leads us to internet governance, and the debate on internet governance has to do with how we will regenerate, replenish the confidence which is quite hurt right now, or how do we adapt to a world where we there's this hypothesis of anonymity, and we need to ask ourselves if we're going to be able to rebuild this in the world of big data, or if we're going to be able to adapt them. Let's go to another issue. The part of maintaining information forever, some of them open in origin were mentioned by Leandro, and I'm going to mention them in a moment. They have to do with the right to forget. This is going to deal with the people treating data, because there's an analyst that said that there was a court order that said that Google had to stop showing the information of Mr. Costeja because he was complaining that he owned money, and that was the first thing in the search results. So the newspaper is not forced to censor itself because he has freedom of the press laws supporting them. So this is more of an issue of the judges saying, okay, this is my position, so I'm going to overinterpret this information. So when we spoke of law of unintended consequences, this is one of the paradoxes. I'd say it's paradoxes that can hurt you. He was known of 100, 200 people who had business, and they say, oh, before I do business with you, please explain to me why you were in a court case. And well, he had been freed, and he paid his debts, etc. And now Mr. Costeja's debts is the most famous individual law in the world, at least in the legal world. So the consequences of the fact that now it's possible to ask a judge to remove you from a Google search means that we're going to search on Bing, or we're going to check on DuckDuckGo or some other searcher that hasn't been penalized. So the absurd of this, of churning different layers of the search engine in something we can't solve in our level of the world, can lead us to absurd restrictions and paralysis even. So aside from even if you digitally erased the information, each of us could have maybe done something that could have been registered by somebody 20 years ago. So technology regulation can't substitute the behavior of a human being. So I'm going to close with this, and I thank you for your attention.